Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The boy or girl paradox. A family has two children, and you're told that at least one of them is a boy. And the question is posed, what is the probability that both children are boys? And the intuitive answer is 1/2. Because the other child is either a boy or a girl with equal probability, but this reasoning is incorrect. The actual probability is 1/3. And this is the boy or girl paradox, a puzzle in conditional probability that has generated confusion and debate for decades, with different versions yielding different answers depending on exactly how the information is obtained and what assumptions are made about the selection process. The solution proceeds by considering all possible, equally likely combinations of two children. There are 4 possibilities: boy-boy, boy-girl, girl-boy, girl-girl, and girl-girl, where the order matters because the first child and second child are distinct, even if both are boys or both are girls. And if we are told that at least one child is a boy, then the girl-girl possibility is eliminated, leaving 3 equally likely cases: boy-boy, boy-girl, and girl-boy. And only in one of these 3 cases are both children boys, and so the probability is 1/3, not 1/2. The paradox arises because the conditioning statement, at least one is a boy, is not the same as knowing the gender of a specific child. If instead we are told that the older child is a boy or the younger child is a boy, then the probability that both are boys becomes 1/2, because we are conditioning on a specific child being a boy rather than on the existential claim that at least one child somewhere in the family is a boy. And this distinction, subtle as it seems, makes a crucial difference to the probability calculation. The boy or girl paradox has many variations that probe the boundaries of the problem and reveal how sensitive the answer is to the exact specification of the scenario. One famous variant involves meeting a man who says he has 2 children, and one of them is a boy named Tuesday, meaning the boy was born on a Tuesday, and this additional information about the day of the week changes the probabilities in a surprising way, because it reduces the number of scenarios consistent with the statement, and the probability that both children are boys increases from 1/3 to 13/27. And this result seems bizarre, seems like the day of the week should be irrelevant, but the mathematics is sound. The additional specificity affects the conditional probabilities. Another variation asks, what if you meet a man with 2 children, and you see one of them, a boy? Does this change the answer? And the answer is yes. Seeing a specific boy is different from being told that at least one child is a boy, because seeing introduces selection effects. You are more likely to see a boy in families with 2 boys than in families with 1 boy, and so the probability calculation must account for the process by which the information was obtained, and different processes lead to different answers. And this sensitivity to selection effects is a general feature of conditional probability problems. And it explains why the boy or girl paradox has multiple defensible answers depending on the scenario. The paradox connects to the reference class problem and to debates about the principle of indifference, because applying the principle of indifference requires specifying a reference class, a set of equally likely outcomes, and different choices of reference class lead to different probability assignments. And in the boy or girl paradox, the reference class could be families with at least 1 boy, or it could be situations where someone tells you that at least one child is a boy. And these are different reference classes with different probabilities. And there is no neutral or obvious way to choose between them without more information about how the scenario is set up. The paradox also raises questions about the interpretation of probability statements in natural language. because phrases like, "at least one is a boy," can be interpreted in different ways, as a statement about the existence of a boy in the family, as a statement about what someone knows or has observed, or as a statement about what information has been communicated, and each interpretation leads to different formal models and different probability calculations. And this ambiguity in natural language is a source of many probability paradoxes, where the mathematical answer depends on details that are not fully specified in the informal statement of the problem. Bayesian statisticians and frequentists also interpret the paradox differently. Bayesians treat probability as degrees of belief and calculate conditional probabilities using Bayes' theorem, while frequentists treat probability as long-run frequencies and may question whether the conditional probability is well defined without specifying a clear sampling procedure. And these different philosophical approaches to probability lead to different emphases in how the paradox is understood and resolved, though both traditions agree on the mathematical calculations once the problem is precisely formulated. The boy or girl paradox has practical analogues in genetics and medicine, where the probability of certain conditions depends on family history in ways that are similar to the structure of the paradox. For instance, the probability that a family carries a recessive genetic trait depends on how many children are observed to have the trait, and the calculations must account for ascertainment bias, the fact that families are more likely to come to medical attention if they have affected children, and this bias affects the probability assessments in ways that parallel the selection effects in the boy or girl paradox. The family walks down the street, 2 children beside them, and you know that at least one is a boy, and the question remains, what is the probability that both are boys? And the answer depends on how you came to know this fact, on whether you asked about a specific child or about any child, on whether you saw a boy or were merely told that at least one exists, and each variation of the scenario changes the answer, shifts the probabilities, reveals that conditional probability is sensitive to context, to process, to the mechanisms by which information is acquired and communicated, and the paradox persists as a puzzle, as a teaching tool, as a demonstration of how subtle probability can be, how carefully problems must be formulated, how easily intuition can mislead. And the boy walks ahead, evidence of his existence, shifting probabilities, conditioning beliefs, and the mathematics unfolds, precise and unforgiving, calculating 1/3 or 1/2 or 13/27, depending on the details, and the intuition struggles to keep up, struggles to grasp why the day of the week matters, why seeing is different from being told, why reference classes and selection effects have such profound impacts on what should be simple questions, and the paradox endures, unsettled in the sense that people continue to disagree about which answer is correct for which version, continue to debate whether the problem is well posed, continue to find new variations that test the boundaries of conditional probability, and the family continues walking. The boy or boys or boy and girl continue existing, and the question remains open, answerable only when the scenario is specified with enough precision to eliminate ambiguity, to fix the reference class, to determine the selection process, and until then, the paradox lives on. A reminder that probability is not just mathematics, but interpretation. Not just calculation, but careful attention to how information is obtained, how questions are asked, and how evidence is generated. The coastline paradox, why no one can agree how long Britain's shore is. A mapmaker sits down to measure the length of the coastline of Great Britain, the perimeter of the island, the total distance around its shores. And this seems like a straightforward task, a matter of careful measurement and calculation. But the paradox is that the answer depends on the scale of measurement, on how closely you look, on what size ruler you use to trace the coast. And as the ruler gets smaller, as the measurement becomes more precise, the measured length increases without bound, growing larger and larger, approaching infinity. And so the coastline has no well-defined length, or rather, its length is infinite. Or rather, the question of length becomes meaningless for highly irregular shapes. And this is the coastline paradox, first articulated clearly by mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot, who used it to motivate the study of fractals, shapes that exhibit self-similarity and complexity at all scales. Imagine measuring the coastline with a 100-kilometer ruler, a straight stick 100 kilometers long, and you walk around the island placing the stick end to end, measuring each straight segment. And when you reach the starting point, you add up all the segments and get a total length, perhaps 4,000 kilometers, and this seems like a reasonable measurement. But now imagine using a 10-kilometer ruler instead, a shorter stick. And because the ruler is shorter, it can follow the bends and curves of the coast more closely. It does not cut across bays and headlands, but traces around them. And when you complete the circuit, the total length is longer, perhaps 5,000 kilometers, because the shorter ruler captures more detail, more twists and turns, that the longer ruler missed. And now imagine using a 1-kilometer ruler, even shorter, and it follows the coast even more closely, entering smaller inlets, tracing around individual rocks and peninsulas, and the measured length increases again, perhaps to 7,000 kilometers. Continue this process using shorter and shorter rulers, a 100-meter ruler, a 10-meter ruler, a 1-meter ruler, and each time the measured length increases, because each shorter ruler reveals new details, new irregularities, new ins and outs that the previous ruler smoothed over, and the coastline is fractal-like, exhibiting structure at every scale. Every time you zoom in, you find new complexity, new bays within bays, new peninsulas jutting from peninsulas. And so there is no scale at which the coast becomes smooth, no level of detail at which further refinement stops revealing new length. And if you continue to arbitrarily, small rulers, measuring every pebble, every grain of sand, every molecule, the measured length grows without limit, approaching infinity. And so, the coastline paradox concludes that the coastline has infinite length, or more carefully, that the concept of length as traditionally defined does not apply to highly irregular curves like coastlines. Mandelbrot used this paradox to introduce fractals, geometric shapes characterized by self-similarity and non-integer dimension. And he showed that coastlines, along with many other natural shapes like clouds, mountains, rivers and trees, are better described by fractal geometry than by traditional Euclidean geometry. And fractals have a property called fractal dimension, a number that quantifies how much space the shape fills. And for a smooth curve, the dimension is 1. For a surface, the dimension is 2. But for fractals, the dimension can be a non-integer, like 1.2 or 1.5, indicating that the shape is more than a line, but less than a surface. And coastlines typically have fractal dimensions between 1 and 2, reflecting their intricate, space-filling character. The paradox has practical implications for geography and cartography, because if coastline length depends on measurement scale, then different measurements will give different answers. And there is no single correct answer to the question, how long is the coastline of Great Britain? The answer depends on what resolution of map you use, on what level of detail you include, and different countries and agencies use different conventions, sometimes specifying a minimum feature size or a standard ruler length. But these conventions are arbitrary, and different conventions give different lengths. And so coastline length is not an intrinsic property of the coastline, but a relational property that depends on the measurement method. The paradox also raises philosophical questions about measurement and the nature of geometric properties, because it suggests that some shapes do not have well-defined lengths, that the concept of length, which works well for straight lines and smooth curves, breaks down for irregular shapes, and this is not a limitation of our measuring instruments, but a feature of the shapes themselves. And this raises the question of whether length is a fundamental property of all curves, or whether it is a concept that applies only to sufficiently regular curves. And fractals fall outside the domain where traditional geometric concepts apply. Visualize the coast as an infinitely jagged line, with bays and headlands at every scale. Zoom in on a section and you see smaller bays and headlands. Zoom in again and you see even smaller ones. And this pattern repeats forever. There is no smooth coastline at any level of magnification, only more and more detail, and so tracing the coast means following an infinitely intricate path, and the length of an infinitely intricate path is infinite. And this is the essence of the paradox, that complexity at all scales produces infinite length, that irregular shapes are fundamentally different from regular shapes, and that traditional geometry is inadequate to describe them. The coastline paradox also appears in other contexts, in measuring the length of borders between countries, in measuring the perimeter of cells or the surface area of lungs, both of which exhibit fractal-like structure with increasing detail at smaller scales. And in all these cases, the measured value depends on the scale of measurement, and there is no single correct answer, only a family of answers indexed by measurement resolution. And this multiplicity is not an error or a limitation, but a feature of the geometry, a reflection of the fact that irregular shapes do not have simple scalar properties like length or area in the traditional sense. The mapmaker gives up, unable to provide a single definitive number for the coastline length, or provides multiple numbers with caveats about measurement scale, and the coastline stretches around the island, infinitely detailed, infinitely long if measured with infinite precision, and the paradox remains a reminder that geometry is more complex than Euclid imagined, that natural shapes do not conform to circles and straight lines, that measurement depends on scale, and that some questions like how long is the coastline do not have simple answers, and Mandelbrot's fractals provide a framework for understanding this complexity, for describing and quantifying irregular shapes, and for recognizing that the world is full of structures that are neither one-dimensional nor two-dimensional, but somewhere in between. And the paradox endures, a touchstone in fractal geometry, a demonstration that infinity appears not just in abstract mathematics, but in concrete measurements of real physical objects, and the coastline remains, jagged and intricate, defying simple measurement, a natural fractal that reveals the limits of traditional geometry and the need for new mathematical tools to capture the complexity of the world. The Ellsberg paradox. An urn contains 90 balls, 30 of which are red, and 60 of which are some mix of black and yellow, but the exact proportions of black and yellow are unknown. The 60 non-red balls could be all black, all yellow, or any combination, and you are offered a series of bets, and the choices you face reveal a pattern of preferences that violates the standard axioms of rational decision theory. And this is the Ellsberg paradox, named after Daniel Ellsberg, who presented it in 1961. And the paradox demonstrates that people systematically prefer known probabilities to unknown probabilities, exhibiting what is called ambiguity aversion, a tendency to avoid situations where the probabilities are uncertain, and this preference pattern cannot be accommodated by expected utility theory, which requires that rational agents have well-defined subjective probabilities for all events and choose actions that maximize expected utility, calculated using these probabilities. The first bet involves choosing between two options. Bet A pays if a red ball is drawn, and bet B pays if a black ball is drawn. And most people prefer bet A, preferring to bet on red, where the probability is known to be 30 out of 90, 1/3, rather than betting on black, where the probability is unknown, could be anything from 0 to 60 out of 90. And this preference seems reasonable, seems to reflect a cautious attitude toward uncertainty, a desire to avoid ambiguity. The second bet offers a choice between bet C, which pays if a red or yellow ball is drawn, and bet D, which pays if a black or yellow ball is drawn, and most people prefer bet D, preferring to bet on black or yellow, where the combined probability is known to be 60 out of 90, 2/3, rather than betting on red or yellow, where the probability depends on the unknown proportion of yellow balls. The paradox emerges when these two preferences are combined, because preferring bet A to bet B suggests that the person believes red is more likely than black, that they implicitly assign a higher subjective probability to red, and preferring bet D to bet C suggests that they believe black or yellow is more likely than red or yellow, which implies that black is more likely than red. And these two beliefs are contradictory. If red is more likely than black, then red or yellow should be more likely than black or yellow, given that both involve adding the same unknown proportion of yellow. And so the preference pattern violates the sure thing principle, the axiom that if you prefer X to Y when some event E occurs, and you also prefer X to Y when E does not occur, then you should prefer X to Y unconditionally, regardless of whether you know whether E occurred. The Ellsberg paradox cannot be explained by standard subjective probability theory, because any consistent assignment of subjective probabilities to red, black, and yellow would make the preference for A over B incompatible with the preference for D over C. And so the pattern reveals that people do not have well-defined subjective probabilities for ambiguous events, or that they do not maximize expected utility using those probabilities, and instead they exhibit a preference for known over unknown probabilities, a violation of the completeness axiom of decision theory, which requires that agents must be able to compare all options and have a preference or be indifferent between them. Ellsberg's paradox has inspired alternative decision theories that can accommodate ambiguity aversion, including maximum expected utility theory, where agents consider multiple possible probability distributions consistent with their knowledge and choose the action that maximizes expected utility under the worst-case distribution, effectively being pessimistic about ambiguity, and Choquet expected utility theory, where probabilities are replaced with capacities that need not be additive, allowing for a richer representation of uncertainty, and multiple priors models, where agents maintain a set of probability distributions rather than a single prior, and use decision rules that reflect their attitudes toward this multiplicity. The paradox also connects to debates about rationality and the normative status of decision-theoretic axioms. Some argue that the Ellsberg preferences are irrational, that they reflect cognitive biases or errors in reasoning, and that ideal rational agents would not exhibit ambiguity aversion, would assign consistent subjective probabilities and maximize expected utility, while others argue that ambiguity aversion is perfectly rational, that it reflects a reasonable response to ignorance, that known risks are genuinely different from unknown risks, and that the axioms of expected utility theory, while mathematically elegant, do not capture all aspects of rational decision-making. The paradox has practical implications for economics and finance, because ambiguity aversion affects how people make decisions under uncertainty, how they invest in markets where probabilities are unknown, how they value insurance and options, how they respond to new technologies with uncertain risks. And understanding ambiguity aversion helps explain behaviors that seem puzzling from a standard expected utility perspective, such as the home bias in portfolio choice, where investors prefer domestic assets over foreign assets even when expected returns are higher abroad, and the equity premium puzzle, where the observed returns on stocks are much higher than on bonds, suggesting that investors demand large premiums for bearing ambiguous risks. The urn sits on the table, 90 balls inside, 30 red and 60 mixed, and you must choose, and the choices seem reasonable, seem to reflect a natural caution about the unknown. But the pattern of choices violates the axioms of rational decision theory, reveals a preference structure that cannot be represented by subjective probabilities, and the paradox forces a choice: either accept that the preferences are irrational and should be corrected, or accept that the theory is incomplete and should be extended, and neither option is comfortable. Neither satisfies the desire for a simple unified theory of rational choice. And so the Ellsberg paradox remains, a challenge to orthodoxy, a puzzle that resists easy resolution, a demonstration that human decision-making is more complex than the elegant mathematics of expected utility suggests. And the ambiguity persists. The unknown proportions of black and yellow remain unknown, and we choose as we must, preferring the known to the unknown, preferring certainty to ambiguity, and the theory struggles to accommodate this preference, struggles to explain why it should be rational or how it can be consistent, and the paradox endures, unsolved, unresolved, a permanent thorn in the side of decision theory. A reminder that rationality is contested, that formal models capture some aspects of decision-making but not all, and that the gap between theory and behaviour, between what axioms demand and what people do, may reflect not irrationality, but the inadequacy of the axioms themselves. And the urn waits, the balls wait, the choice waits, and we must decide, knowing some probabilities but not others. And the decision reveals something about us, about how we value knowledge and fear ignorance, about whether ambiguity is just another form of risk or something fundamentally different. And the paradox lingers, unresolved, unsettled, a puzzle that decision theory has not yet tamed. The Fat Man variant, when pushing someone off a bridge, becomes murder. The runaway trolley races toward 5 people bound to the tracks, the same setup as before, but now there is no lever, no switch to pull, no way to divert the trolley onto another track, and you stand on a footbridge directly above the tracks, watching the trolley approach, and next to you stands a very large person, large enough and heavy enough that if they fell onto the tracks, their body would stop the trolley, would derail it or bring it to a halt, saving the 5 people below, but killing the large person instantly. And you could push this person, could place your hands on their back and shove them over the railing, and they would fall, and the trolley would stop, and 5 lives would be saved at the cost of 1. And the numbers are identical to the original trolley problem, 5 saved and 1 killed, but the method is different. And this difference makes most people recoil, makes them say no, I would not push, even though the consequence is the same as pulling the lever in the original case. And this asymmetry is the heart of the Fat Man variant, sometimes called the footbridge problem, a thought experiment that probes our moral intuitions about direct versus indirect harm, about using people as means versus affecting them as side effects, and about the limits of consequentialist reasoning. Imagine yourself on the bridge, the large person standing peacefully beside you, unaware of the danger below, and you know that pushing them will save 5 lives. The calculus is clear, 1 death versus 5 deaths, and if outcomes are all that matter, then pushing is required, is morally obligatory, is the obviously right choice. But your hands hesitate, your body resists, because pushing feels like murder, feels like killing, feels fundamentally wrong in a way that pulling a lever does not. And this feeling, this visceral moral reaction, reveals something about how we think about ethics, reveals that we distinguish between different ways of bringing about the same result, that the means matter, not just the ends, that how we save lives affects whether saving them is permissible. The distinction centres on intentionality and instrumentalisation. In the original lever case pulling, the lever diverts the trolley, and the 1 person on the side track dies as an unfortunate consequence. Their death is foreseen, but not intended. You are not trying to kill them. You are trying to redirect the trolley, and their presence on the track is almost incidental. If they were not there, the trolley would still be diverted and the 5 would still be saved, whereas in the Fat Man case, pushing the person is specifically intended to use their body as an obstruction. Their death is not a side effect, but the means by which the trolley is stopped. You are deliberately killing them to achieve your goal, and if by some miracle they survived the fall, the trolley would not be stopped and the 5 would not be saved. Their death is essential to your plan, is what you're aiming at. And this makes the act feel more like murder, more like treating a human being as a mere object, as a tool to be used and discarded. Kantian ethics formalizes this intuition through the principle that persons are ends in themselves and should never be treated merely as means. And pushing the large person treats them as a mere means, uses their body without their consent to achieve a goal, reduces them to an instrument. Whereas pulling the lever does not treat the one person on the sidetrack as a means. They are harmed as a side effect, but not used, not instrumentalized. And this distinction, Kantians argue, is morally crucial, marks the line between permissible and impermissible killing. And the Fat Man variant falls on the wrong side, is impermissible because it uses a person, violates their dignity, treats them as less than fully human. Consequentialists reject this reasoning, argue that the distinction between intended and foreseen harm is morally irrelevant, that what matters is the result. 5 lives saved and 1 life lost. And whether the one person is killed as a means or as a side effect makes no difference to the outcome, makes no difference to the people involved. The large person dies either way. The 5 people are saved either way, and refusing to push means accepting 5 deaths to avoid one, means valuing squeamishness or abstract principles over actual lives. And this seems absurd, seems like letting moral theory override common sense. And consequentialists argue that in extreme cases, in genuine life or death dilemmas, the right action is the one that minimizes harm, maximizes welfare, saves the most lives. And any principle that forbids this is flawed, is giving too much weight to feelings and not enough to results. Visualize the large person standing on the bridge. They have thoughts, feelings, plans, loved ones, a life with value and meaning. And you're contemplating ending that life, snuffing it out. Not in self-defense, not as punishment, but as a tool to save others. And this feels different from pulling a lever. Feels more intimate, more violent, more like hands-on killing. And psychological research confirms this. People report stronger emotional reactions to the footbridge scenario, stronger activation of brain regions associated with personal moral judgment. And this emotional response is not irrational or mere squeamishness, but reflects deep moral intuitions about personal agency, about the wrongness of directly causing harm to an individual, about the sanctity of bodily autonomy. The Fat Man variant also raises questions about consent and voluntariness, because the large person has not volunteered to be sacrificed, has not consented to being used as a trolley stopper, and using their body without permission violates autonomy, violates the principle that competent adults have the right to control what happens to their own bodies. And this is true even if using them would save lives, even if the overall outcome would be better, because respecting autonomy means allowing people to refuse to help. Even when helping would be beneficial, means recognizing that people are not resources to be allocated for the greater good, but individuals with rights, with the right to say no, with the right not to be sacrificed against their will. Some philosophers have proposed intermediate cases to test the boundaries. Suppose the large person is standing on a trapdoor that you could open remotely, dropping them onto the tracks without physically touching them. Is this more like the lever case or more like the pushing case? Or suppose the large person is terminally ill and unconscious. Does this change the moral calculus? Does it make using them more permissible? Or suppose they have explicitly consented in advance to being used in such situations? Does consent eliminate the moral problem? And these variations probe the principles at stake. Try to isolate what exactly makes the pushing wrong, whether it is the direct causation, the physical contact, the lack of consent, the instrumentalization, or some combination. And different moral theories give different answers, diagnose the wrongness differently, and the variant becomes a tool for testing ethical theories, for exposing their commitments and seeing where they lead. The footbridge stands above the tracks. The large person breathes beside you unaware. The trolley approaches and the 5 people below are oblivious to their doom. And you must decide, push or do not push, kill or let die, violate one person's rights, or allow 5 people to perish. And there is no time for lengthy deliberation. No time to consult ethicists or calculate utilities. Only a choice that will haunt you regardless. Because pushing means you killed someone, placed your hands on them, and ended their life. And not pushing means 5 people died who could have been saved. And either way, the weight is crushing. The responsibility immense, and the Fat Man variant offers no comfort, no resolution, only the stark presentation of a choice that reveals the limits of moral theory, the inadequacy of simple principles, the irreducible difficulty of cases where values conflict, where any action involves loss, and the problem remains, a thought experiment that disturbs, that challenges, that refuses to yield easy answers, and that reminds us that morality is not a puzzle with solutions, but a practice requiring wisdom, courage, and the willingness to live with choices that are never fully justified, never free of doubt, never untainted by the recognition that whatever we do, someone suffers, and we are responsible. The free rider problem: why nobody pays for what everyone wants. A community needs a public good, needs streetlights perhaps, or clean air or national defence, and this good has a special property. It is non-excludable. Once provided, it is available to everyone, regardless of whether they contributed to its provision, and it is non-rivalrous. One person's use does not reduce availability for others. And these properties create a problem, create incentives for free riding, for enjoying the benefits without bearing the costs, and each individual reasons that their contribution is small, is negligible, will not determine whether the good is provided, and so they can free ride, can enjoy the streetlights, whether they pay or not. And since paying is costly, and the good will be provided or not, regardless of their individual contribution, it is individually rational to free ride. And if everyone reasons this way, then no one contributes. The good is not provided, and everyone is worse off than if everyone had contributed. And this is the free rider problem, a fundamental challenge in public economics, a demonstration that voluntary provision of public goods is difficult, tends toward under-provision, and solving the problem requires mechanisms that make contribution individually rational, requires collective action, requires institutions that enable groups to provide goods that individuals cannot or will not provide voluntarily. And the free rider problem explains why governments exist, why taxation is necessary, why voluntary charity is insufficient for providing public goods. And the problem remains central to political philosophy, to debates about the role of government, to questions about when collective coercion is justified. Imagine a neighbourhood deciding whether to install streetlights, and the lights would benefit everyone, would make the streets safer, would be valued by all residents. And suppose the lights cost $100 per household, and each household values the lights at $150. So collectively, the benefit exceeds the cost. Provision is efficient, but each household faces a decision: contribute or free ride. And the calculation is straightforward. If enough others contribute, the lights will be installed regardless of whether I contribute. And if I contribute, I pay $100 and get $150 of benefit for net benefits of $50. But if I free ride, I pay nothing and still get $150 of benefit for net benefits of $150. So I am better off free riding, and if not enough others contribute, then the lights will not be installed regardless of whether I contribute. And if I contribute, I pay $100 and get nothing because the lights are not installed. And if I free ride, I pay nothing and get nothing. So I am no worse off free riding, and in both cases, free riding dominates contributing. And since every household reasons this way, no one contributes, the lights are not installed, and everyone loses the net benefit they could have had. And this is the free rider problem. The free rider problem demonstrates that individual rationality can lead to collective inefficiency, that goods which everyone wants can fail to be provided because no individual has incentive to contribute, and the problem is structural, is inherent in the properties of public goods, and cannot be solved by appealing to altruism or social responsibility, because even small amounts of altruism are insufficient, because as long as some people free ride, the burden on contributors increases, and this creates resentment, undermines cooperation, and voluntary provision tends to fail. And the solution typically involves coercion, involves mandatory contributions through taxation, and governments exist partly to solve free rider problems, to provide public goods through collective funding, and taxation is justified on the grounds that it enables provision of goods that voluntary contribution cannot reliably provide. Visualize the free rider problem as a threshold public good, where the good is provided only if total contributions exceed some threshold, and individuals must decide whether to contribute without knowing whether others will contribute, and the dominant strategy is to free ride because your contribution is costly and makes little difference to whether the threshold is met, and everyone free rides. The threshold is not met. The good is not provided, and this shows why voluntary provision fails, why collective action problems arise, why coordination on contribution is difficult without institutional mechanisms. And solving the problem requires commitment devices, requires mechanisms that ensure contributions are made, that prevent free riding, and taxation is one such mechanism, makes contribution mandatory, eliminates the free riding option, and enables provision of public goods that markets fail to provide. One response to the free rider problem is Lindahl taxation, a theoretical solution where each individual pays according to their marginal benefit from the public good, pays their willingness to pay, and this makes contribution individually rational because you pay only what the good is worth to you. But Lindahl taxation faces practical problems, requires knowing each person's valuation, which people have incentive to misrepresent, have incentive to understate to reduce their tax burden, and the mechanism is not incentive compatible, is vulnerable to strategic behaviour, and cannot be implemented in practice. And so while Lindahl taxation is theoretically optimal, it does not solve the real-world free rider problem. Another response is assurance contracts, where contributions are collected conditionally, are returned if the threshold is not met. And this solves one problem with voluntary provision, eliminates the risk of contributing without the good being provided. But assurance contracts do not eliminate free riding incentive, do not make contributing dominant, because you still benefit from the good whether you contribute or not. And so assurance contracts help but do not fully solve the problem, and empirical evidence shows that contribution rates improve with assurance contracts but remain below optimal levels. A third response is social sanctions, where free riders are punished through social disapproval, through reputation loss, through exclusion from other cooperative activities, and social sanctions can support contribution in small groups where behaviour is observable, where reputation matters, where repeated interaction creates incentives for cooperation, and community provision of public goods often relies on social sanctions, relies on norms that support contribution and punish free riding. And these mechanisms can be effective in tight-knit communities but are less effective in large anonymous societies where behaviour is hard to observe and reputation effects are weak. The free rider problem also appears in debates about international cooperation, about providing global public goods like climate stability, pandemic prevention, biodiversity preservation, and these goods are non-excludable and non-rivalrous at global scale, and nations face free rider incentives, benefit from the good whether they contribute or not. And this makes international cooperation difficult, makes agreements fragile, and nations have incentive to free ride, to benefit from others' contributions while minimizing their own. And solving global free rider problems requires international institutions, requires mechanisms for monitoring and enforcement, requires ways to make contribution individually rational for nations. And the difficulty of achieving such cooperation explains why global public goods are underprovided, why climate change proceeds despite universal acknowledgement of its dangers, why pandemic preparedness is inadequate despite obvious benefits. The problem also raises philosophical questions about political obligation, about whether citizens have duties to support public goods, whether taxation is legitimate coercion or justified contribution, and libertarians argue that taxation for public goods is problematic, violates individual rights, and anarcho-capitalists argue that even genuine public goods should be provided voluntarily or not at all, while social democrats argue that taxation is justified to solve collective action problems, is necessary for provision of goods that voluntary mechanisms cannot reliably provide, and the debate turns on whether the free rider problem justifies coercion, whether preventing free riding is sufficient reason to impose mandatory contributions, and different political philosophies answer differently. Some argue that the free rider problem is overstated, that voluntary provision is more successful than theory predicts, that people do contribute to public goods despite free rider incentives. And empirical evidence supports this, shows that people do contribute voluntarily to charities, to public radio, to open source software, and contribution rates exceed zero even when free riding is possible. And this suggests that people are not purely self-interested, have preferences for fairness, for contributing to collective goods, for avoiding being seen as free riders, and behavioral economics explains these patterns through social preferences, through conditional cooperation, through warm glow effects from giving, and while voluntary provision remains below optimal levels, it is not zero, and this shows that humans are more cooperative than pure economic theory predicts. But it does not eliminate the free rider problem, does not make voluntary provision reliably sufficient, and government provision remains necessary for most public goods. The streetlights remain dark, the clean air remains polluted, the defence remains unprovided, and everyone wishes for the public good, but no one contributes. Everyone free rides, everyone waits for others to pay, and the good is not provided, and the free rider problem persists as one of the fundamental challenges in political economy, remains a justification for government, remains a reason why taxation exists, why collective provision is necessary, and the problem shows that markets fail for public goods, that voluntary mechanisms are insufficient, that individual rationality leads to collective inefficiency, and solving the problem requires institutions, requires mechanisms that make contribution mandatory, or that change incentives to make contribution rational, and without such mechanisms, public goods are underprovided. Remain goods that everyone wants but nobody provides, and the free rider problem endures. The grandfather paradox. Time travel has long been a staple of science fiction, a dream of visiting the past or glimpsing the future. But woven into this fantasy is a logical nightmare that has haunted physicists and philosophers alike. And this is the grandfather paradox, a thought experiment that questions whether travelling backward in time could ever be possible without creating contradictions that tear reality apart. Imagine a person who builds a time machine and travels back to a point before their own birth, and while in the past this person encounters their grandfather as a young man, before he has met the traveller's grandmother, before any children have been conceived, and in a moment of recklessness or malice or accident, the time traveller kills their grandfather. The question that follows is immediate and devastating. If the grandfather dies before fathering any children, then the time traveller's parent is never born. And if the parent is never born, then the time traveller is never born. And if the time traveller is never born, then no one travels back in time to kill the grandfather, which means the grandfather lives, which means the parent is born, which means the time traveller is born, which means someone does travel back in time to kill the grandfather, and the loop closes, a perfect circle of cause and effect that devours itself. The paradox suggests that backward time travel, if possible, would permit changes to the past that erase their own causes, creating logical contradictions that seem to violate the basic structure of causality, the idea that causes precede effects, that events unfold in a coherent sequence rather than collapsing into impossible tangles. Some physicists argue that the paradox proves time travel to the past is impossible, that the laws of physics must somehow prevent any action that would create a causal loop or alter history in a way that leads to contradiction. And this idea is formalized in the Novikov self-consistency principle, which states that if time travel is possible, then only self-consistent timelines can occur, meaning the time traveler would find themselves unable to kill their grandfather. No matter how hard they tried, the gun would jam, the traveler would hesitate, something would always intervene to preserve consistency. Others propose the many worlds interpretation, suggesting that when the time traveler kills their grandfather, they create a branching timeline, a parallel universe where the grandfather dies and the traveler is never born in that branch, while in the original timeline, everything continues as before. And so no true paradox arises because the timelines never contradict each other. They simply diverge. Still others embrace the idea that time is not a single linear path, but a more complex structure, a block universe where past, present, and future all exist simultaneously, and where time travel is simply movement through a fixed four-dimensional landscape. And in such a universe, the grandfather was always killed by the time traveler. The timeline was always that way. There is no changing of history because history is immutable. All events, including the time travel, are already written into the fabric of space-time. The paradox also raises questions about identity and causation, about what it means to exist, about whether effects can precede their causes, and whether the universe permits contradictions or whether reality itself enforces logical consistency as a fundamental law. The grandfather paradox remains one of the most vivid illustrations of the conceptual challenges posed by backward causation, a puzzle that blends physics with metaphysics, science with philosophy, and that forces anyone dreaming of time travel to confront the possibility that the past, once written, cannot be rewritten without unraveling the very threads that make existence coherent. The hedonistic paradox: why chasing happiness makes you miserable. Happiness is what everyone wants, pleasure and contentment and satisfaction, the good feelings that make life worth living, and hedonism is the philosophy that says pleasure is the highest good, that we should pursue happiness and avoid pain, that maximizing pleasant experiences is the rational goal of life. And this seems straightforward, seems like obvious common sense. Who would argue against seeking happiness? And yet a strange paradox emerges. The more directly you pursue happiness, the more it eludes you. The more you focus on your own pleasure, the less pleasure you actually experience. And this is the hedonistic paradox, also called the paradox of hedonism, first articulated clearly by philosopher Henry Sidgwick in the 19th century and echoed by thinkers from ancient Stoics to modern psychologists. The observation that happiness cannot be obtained by pursuing it directly, that it comes instead as a byproduct of other activities, of pursuing goals and relationships and meaningful projects that are not themselves about happiness. And the paradox reveals something deep about human psychology, about the nature of satisfaction, about how conscious desire and self-awareness can undermine the very experiences they seek. Imagine someone who decides to maximize their happiness, who reads books about pleasure, who measures their mood constantly, who makes decisions based purely on what will bring the most immediate satisfaction, choosing activities because they are supposed to be fun, spending time with people because those people are supposed to make them happy, eating foods because they are supposed to taste good. And this person is completely focused on their own hedonic state, monitoring their feelings, evaluating whether each moment is bringing sufficient pleasure. And paradoxically, this constant self-monitoring and evaluation interferes with enjoyment, prevents immersion, creates anxiety about whether happiness is being achieved. And the person finds that despite optimizing for pleasure, they feel less satisfied than when they were not trying so hard, when they were engaged in activities for their own sake, rather than as means to happiness. The paradox operates through several mechanisms. One is self-consciousness. When you're focused on your own experience, watching yourself to see if you're happy, you cannot be fully present in the moment, cannot lose yourself in an activity. And this divided attention, this standing outside yourself observing, prevents the flow states and deep engagement that actually produce lasting satisfaction. Like trying to fall asleep by focusing intently on falling asleep, the effort itself becomes an obstacle, creates tension that prevents the desired state. And the same applies to pleasure. The monitoring prevents the experience. Another mechanism is adaptation and expectation. When happiness becomes the explicit goal, expectations rise. And when expectations rise, satisfaction falls. Because satisfaction depends not just on absolute pleasure, but on the gap between expectation and reality. And someone who expects to be happy all the time, who demands high levels of pleasure, will be disappointed by ordinary experiences that might have been satisfying without the inflated expectations. And so the pursuit of happiness creates conditions that make happiness harder to achieve. A third mechanism involves meaning and purpose, because the activities that produce the deepest and most lasting satisfaction are often those pursued for reasons other than pleasure, work that feels meaningful, relationships built on genuine care rather than instrumental benefit, creative projects undertaken for their own sake, struggles and challenges that are difficult but worthwhile. And these activities produce satisfaction precisely because they are not aimed at happiness, because they involve commitment to something beyond the self. And when happiness becomes the goal, these activities lose their meaning, become merely instruments for feeling good, and the meaning drains away, and with it the satisfaction. Visualize a person at a party who is there solely to have a good time, who evaluates every conversation by whether it is making them happy, who moves from group to group seeking the optimal pleasure, and compare this to someone who is genuinely interested in the people they meet, who engages with conversations because the topics matter, who is fully present rather than constantly evaluating. And the second person, paradoxically, has a better time, experiences more pleasure, not because they were aiming for it, but because they were aiming at something else, at connection, at understanding, at engagement. The ancient Stoics recognized this paradox, argued that pursuing pleasure directly leads to disappointment and suffering, that the wise person should instead focus on virtue, on living according to nature, on accepting what happens with equanimity. And happiness emerges as a consequence of wisdom and virtue rather than as a direct goal. And the Stoics were hedonism's critics, argued that pleasure is too unreliable, too fleeting, too dependent on external circumstances to be a good foundation for life. And the hedonistic paradox supports this critique, shows that even on hedonism's own terms, even accepting that pleasure is what we ultimately want, the direct pursuit of pleasure is self-defeating. John Stuart Mill, himself a utilitarian who believed in maximizing happiness, acknowledged the paradox and distinguished between higher and lower pleasures, suggesting that the deepest satisfaction comes from intellectual and moral activities rather than from sensory gratification, and that a life spent chasing immediate sensory pleasure is less happy than a life devoted to knowledge, virtue, and meaningful relationships, even if the latter involves more difficulty and occasional pain. Modern psychology has confirmed the hedonistic paradox. Through empirical research, studies show that people who explicitly prioritize happiness report lower life satisfaction than those who prioritize other values like meaning, relationships, or personal growth, that people who pursue pleasure for its own sake experience more depression and anxiety, that flow states and peak experiences occur when people are absorbed in challenging activities, not when they are relaxing or seeking pleasure directly, and that the happiest societies are not those where people pursue individual happiness most intensely, but those where people are embedded in strong communities and engaged in collective projects that transcend individual pleasure. The paradox also appears in consumer culture, where advertising promises happiness through products, through purchases, through experiences designed to deliver pleasure. And people chase these promises, buying things they do not need, pursuing lifestyles marketed as paths to satisfaction, and finding that the purchases bring momentary pleasure followed by adaptation and renewed dissatisfaction. The hedonic treadmill, where each purchase raises expectations and the baseline returns to where it was, and the pursuit of happiness through consumption becomes a trap, a cycle that produces more desire than satisfaction, more anxiety than contentment. And the paradox reveals that happiness is not a commodity, cannot be bought or manufactured, cannot be achieved by optimizing choices, but emerges from patterns of life, from relationships and meaning and engagement with the world. Some philosophers have argued that the hedonistic paradox refutes hedonism entirely, shows that pleasure cannot be the ultimate good because it cannot be achieved by aiming at it, that any theory of value must accommodate the fact that some goods are essentially byproducts, cannot be attained through direct pursuit, and this points toward alternative theories like virtue ethics, where the goal is to develop character traits and live well rather than to maximize pleasant experiences, or like existentialism, where the goal is authenticity and creating meaning rather than achieving happiness. Others argue that the paradox does not refute hedonism, but only shows that indirect strategies are required, that sophisticated hedonists should not focus on their own happiness, but should pursue other goals, knowing that these pursuits will produce happiness as a side effect. And this move preserves hedonism as a theory of value, while acknowledging the psychological reality that direct pursuit fails. The person sits alone, measuring their happiness on a scale from 1 to 10, recording their mood, planning activities to maximize pleasure, and the numbers are disappointing, the satisfaction elusive, and slowly the realization dawns that the pursuit itself is the problem, that happiness was never meant to be a target but a byproduct, that the good life is not found by seeking it but by living it, by engaging with the world, by caring about things beyond oneself, by accepting that some suffering is inevitable and some pleasures are fleeting, and that meaning is more important than happiness anyway. And the paradox resolves not by discovering a technique for achieving happiness, but by abandoning happiness as the goal, by recognizing that the best moments come unbidden, arrive when we are focused elsewhere, and that the life worth living is not the one that feels best moment to moment, but the one that matters, that connects, that contributes, and the hedonistic paradox remains, not as a puzzle to solve, but as a truth to accept, a reminder that we are not built for pure pleasure seeking, that our psychology is more complex than simple hedonism allows, and that the path to satisfaction runs through meaning and connection and purpose, rather than through the direct pursuit of happiness itself. The inverted spectrum problem. What if your red looks like my blue? Two people stand before a ripe tomato, and both say the tomato is red. Both use the word correctly. Both learned colour terms in the same way, by being shown red objects and hearing the word red. And their colour vision is normal. Their eyes and brains function identically. And yet the question arises, do they see the same colour? Does the tomato produce the same subjective experience in both? Or could it be that what one person experiences as red, the other experiences as blue? That their colour experiences are inverted, their spectrums reversed, and yet because they learned language the same way, because red things produce the same relative patterns, they both call the same things red, and have no way of discovering that their experiences differ. And this is the inverted spectrum problem, a thought experiment that has troubled philosophers since Locke, a puzzle about whether subjective experiences are private, whether they could differ between people in ways that behavioural and physical evidence cannot detect, and whether such differences would matter, whether they would mean anything if they are undetectable in principle. Imagine spectrum inversion more precisely. Person A sees red things as having the experience that person B has when seeing blue things, and person A sees blue things as having the experience person B has when seeing red, and this inversion is systematic, extends across the entire spectrum. Green is inverted with purple, orange with indigo, and so on. And both people learned colour words by associating them with the experiences they actually have. So person A learned to call things red that produce the blue experience, and person B learned to call things red that produce the red experience, and their language use is identical, their behaviour indistinguishable, and the inversion is undetectable from the outside, cannot be discovered through any behavioural test, through any physical measurement, through any scientific investigation, because all the objective facts are the same. Only the subjective experiences differ. The inverted spectrum problem raises questions about the privacy of qualia, about whether subjective experiences are essentially first personal, accessible only to the person having them, and if spectrum inversion is possible, then qualia are private, are not reducible to anything public or objective, because two people with inverted spectrums have different qualia despite having identical physical states and identical behaviours. And this challenges functionalism, challenges the view that mental states are defined by their functional roles, by their patterns of causes and effects, because inverted spectrums have the same functional roles but different experiential qualities, and so functional role does not determine qualia, does not exhaust the nature of conscious experience. Visualize the problem as a question about the relationship between physical processes and subjective experience. The same physical processes, the same wavelengths of light, the same retinal responses, the same neural firings produce different experiences in inverted people, red experience versus blue experience. And this suggests that experience is not determined by physical processes alone, that there is something additional, something that could vary even when physical processes are fixed. And this something is what philosophers call qualia, the intrinsic experiential qualities of mental states. The what, it is likeness, and the inverted spectrum problem shows, or claims to show, that qualia are real, are distinct from physical and functional properties, are private and subjective. One response to the inverted spectrum problem denies that spectrum inversion is possible, argues that colour experiences are tied to their functional roles, to how they affect behaviour and other mental states, and systematic inversion would require inverting all these connections, would require changing not just colour experiences, but all the associations and reactions and emotions connected to colours. And once all these changes are made, the supposedly inverted person no longer has genuinely inverted experiences, but has the same experiences in a different functional network. And genuine inversion, preserving all functional roles while changing only qualia, is impossible, is incoherent, and the thought experiment fails because it describes an impossible scenario. Another response accepts that spectrum inversion is possible, but argues that it does not threaten functionalism or physicalism, because if inversion is undetectable in principle, then it is not a real difference, not a difference that matters, and science is concerned with objective differences, with differences that make a difference to behaviour or physical processes, and subjective differences that have no objective manifestation are not the kind of things science needs to explain, are not part of the natural world that science investigates. And so the inverted spectrum problem, even if it shows that qualia are private, does not show that they are non-physical, only that they are aspects of physical states that science does not need to characterize in its theories. A third response appeals to the ecological theory of perception, argues that colour experiences are not arbitrary inner states, but are shaped by the environment, by what colours signify, by their natural and biological meanings. And red looks the way it does because of its associations with blood, fire, ripe fruit, danger, and these associations are grounded in evolutionary history, in universal human experiences, and systematic inversion would disrupt these associations, would make red look restful and blue look alarming, and this would be detectable, would affect behaviour, and so genuine spectrum inversion, preserving all functional roles, including emotional and associative roles, is impossible. The inverted spectrum problem also connects to the problem of other minds, because if spectrum inversion is possible, then we cannot know what other people experience, cannot know whether their red is our red or our blue. And this creates a kind of skepticism, a recognition that subjective experience is essentially private, is not fully accessible to others, and while we can know what people say about their experiences, what behaviours they exhibit, we cannot know what they actually feel, what their experiences are like from the inside. And this privacy is both troubling and profound, suggests that each person's consciousness is a private world, knowable fully only to themselves. Some philosophers argue that the inverted spectrum problem trades on confusion about the nature of colour experience, that colours are not simple intrinsic qualities, but are defined by their relationships to other colours, to contexts, to perceptual constancies, and that inverting these relationships is not coherent, not a genuine possibility, and that the thought experiment misleads us by treating colours as if they were simple atoms of experience that could be swapped without affecting anything else, when in fact colour experience is holistic, is embedded in networks of perception and cognition, and cannot be varied independently. Others embrace the inverted spectrum problem, argue that it reveals important truths about consciousness, that qualia are real, are private, are not reducible to functional or physical properties, and that any theory of consciousness must accommodate this, must allow for the possibility that physically and functionally identical beings could differ in their subjective experiences, and this supports property dualism, supports the view that phenomenal properties are additional to physical properties, are aspects of reality that physical science cannot capture. The two people stand before the tomato, both calling it red, and the question lingers, do they see the same thing? Do their experiences match? Or does one see what the other would call blue? And there is no way to tell. No test that reveals the truth, and the privacy of experience persists. The possibility that our inner worlds differ in ways we cannot communicate, in ways language cannot capture, and the inverted spectrum problem remains, not solved, not refuted, not accepted, but persistent as a challenge to theories of mind, as a thought experiment that probes the nature of subjective experience, as a question about whether qualia are private, whether consciousness has aspects that resist objective description, and whether the inner life of another person is truly accessible or forever hidden behind the veil of their behaviour and their words. And the tomato remains red, called red by both, but whether they see the same red, whether their experiences converge or diverge behind the labels, remains uncertain, remains one of the enduring mysteries about the nature of consciousness and the privacy of subjective experience. The ladder paradox: how moving objects shrink and fit where they shouldn't. A ladder 10 meters long rushes toward a garage that is only 8 meters deep. The garage has a front door and a back door, both initially open, and the ladder is traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light, fast enough that length contraction becomes important. And according to special relativity objects moving at high speed contract along their direction of motion, and an observer standing in the garage watching the ladder approach calculates that at 80% of light speed the ladder contracts to 6 meters, shorter than the garage, and so the observer plans to trap the ladder inside by simultaneously closing both doors for a brief moment, catching the entire contracted ladder inside the 8-meter garage. And this seems straightforward. The moving ladder fits because it is contracted, but now consider the perspective of someone riding on the ladder. In their reference frame, the ladder is at rest and maintains its full 10-meter length, while the garage is moving toward them at 80% of light speed, and so the garage contracts to less than 5 meters deep. far too small to contain the 10-meter ladder, and the person on the ladder knows that the front of the ladder will exit the back door before the back of the ladder enters the front door. And trapping the ladder inside is impossible, and so the two observers disagree about whether the ladder fits inside the garage, whether both doors can be closed simultaneously with the ladder inside. And this is the ladder paradox, also called the barn pole paradox, a puzzle about how length contraction and simultaneity interact in special relativity. The resolution lies in understanding that simultaneity is relative, that events which are simultaneous in one reference frame are not simultaneous in another, and the garage observer sees both doors closing at the same time, trapping the ladder, but the ladder observer sees the doors closing at different times. The front door closes first, then the back door closes later, and in the ladder frame, the sequence of events is as follows. The front of the ladder, still 10 meters away from the back of the ladder, enters the contracted garage and immediately exits the back door. And only after the entire ladder has passed through the garage does the back door close, followed by the front door closing. And so in the ladder frame, the ladder never fits entirely inside the garage. It is always longer than the garage, but the doors are never closed simultaneously with the ladder inside, and this removes the contradiction. Both observers agree on the physical facts. They agree on when collisions occur, on whether the ladder gets scratched or damaged, but they disagree about which events are simultaneous, about the order in which certain events happen. And this disagreement is not a matter of illusion or observation delay, but a fundamental feature of space-time in special relativity. Imagine space-time diagrams for both perspectives. In the garage frame, the diagram shows the two doors as vertical lines fixed in position, and the ladder as a diagonal streak moving horizontally through space and vertically through time. And the ladder is shortened by length contraction. And there is a moment when the back of the ladder has entered the front door and the front of the ladder has not yet exited the back door. And at this moment, both doors can be closed simultaneously, trapping the contracted ladder. And in the ladder frame, the diagram shows the ladder as two vertical lines, the front and back of the ladder stationary, and the garage as a moving object, contracted along the direction of motion. And the two doors close at different times. First, the front door closes and then opens, allowing the front of the ladder to pass. And then the back door closes after the back of the ladder has already entered. And the doors are never simultaneously closed around the ladder, and both descriptions are correct. Both are consistent with the laws of physics, and the apparent contradiction arises only from expecting that simultaneous in one frame means simultaneous in all frames. And relativity denies this. Simultaneity is frame dependent. The paradox also highlights the role of signals and information, because if the closing of the doors is controlled by signals sent at the speed of light, then the relativity of simultaneity ensures that the signals arrive at different times in different frames, and the physical mechanism that closes the doors respects causality and relativity, and no contradiction arises. The doors can be set to close when the ladder is inside, as measured in the garage frame, and this same mechanism, viewed from the ladder frame, closes the doors at different times, and the ladder is never trapped because it never fits entirely inside, and both descriptions are correct and consistent. Some people find this resolution unsatisfying. It seems like the ladder either fits or does not fit. There should be an objective fact of the matter, but relativity says that fits inside is not an objective notion. When motion is involved, it depends on what simultaneity convention is used, on which reference frame is chosen, and different frames can disagree about spatial relationships without any frame being wrong. And this is one of the deepest lessons of relativity, that spatial and temporal relationships are frame dependent, that there is no absolute space or absolute time, and that what counts as simultaneous or as fitting inside depends on the observer's state of motion. The ladder paradox has practical analogues in particle physics, where particles travelling at relativistic speeds appear contracted in the laboratory frame. And this contraction affects how they interact with detectors, how they traverse magnetic fields, and how their collisions are modelled, and physicists routinely account for length contraction and time dilation in analysing experiments. And the paradoxical features of relativity are not mere thought experiments, but daily realities in accelerator laboratories. Visualise the ladder streaking toward the garage, its atoms compressed along the direction of motion. The electromagnetic forces between atoms adjusted by the motion, creating a physically shorter object in the garage frame, and the garage rushing toward the ladder in the ladder frame, compressed to a narrow slit, and the ladder threading through this slit without ever being contained. And both pictures are correct, both are consistent, and the paradox dissolves once simultaneity is properly understood, once it is accepted that different observers experience different orderings of spatially separated events, and the ladder paradox remains a teaching tool, an illustration of how length contraction and relativity of simultaneity work together, how apparent contradictions in relativity are resolved by careful analysis of reference frames, and how our intuitions about space and time, trained on low-speed everyday experience, fail completely when speeds approach that of light, and the ladder passes through, contracted or not, trapped or not, depending on who you ask, depending on what frame you occupy, and the paradox endures as a reminder that space and time are not what they seem. That motion affects not just how we measure things, but what length and simultaneity mean, and that Einstein's revolution was not just about equations, but about reconceiving the very fabric of reality. The manipulation argument, when being programmed feels like choosing. A scientist creates a person in a laboratory, designs their brain molecule by molecule, programs their psychology precisely, installs specific beliefs, desires, values, personality traits, and then releases this person into the world, and the person deliberates about what to do, weighs options, considers consequences, makes decisions based on their reasons, their desires, their values, and all of this psychological processing feels normal from the inside, feels like genuine deliberation, genuine choice, and yet the person's entire psychology was determined by the scientist, was programmed. And so the person's choices are not really their own, not really free. Are the scientist's choices implemented through the person's brain? And the person is not responsible for actions that flow from programmed psychology, is more like a puppet than an agent. And this is the manipulation argument against compatibilism. The argument that being determined by natural causes, by genes and environment, is relevantly similar to being determined by manipulation, by programming. And if programmed persons lack free will, then naturally determined persons also lack free will. And since determinism says all persons are naturally determined, all persons lack free will if determinism is true, and compatibilism is false. And this manipulation argument, developed by Dirk Peerboom and others, creates a serious challenge for compatibilist theories. Forces compatibilists to explain how natural determination differs from manipulation, how being caused by evolution and upbringing differs from being caused by a neuroscientist. And the argument remains controversial, remains debated, and compatibilists offer various responses. But the challenge persists. Imagine the manipulated person situation. They wake up in the laboratory, memories implanted, personality formed, and they go about their life, make choices, pursue goals, and from their perspective, everything seems normal. They feel like they are choosing freely, feel like their decisions are their own, and yet every thought, every desire, every value was installed by the scientist. And nothing about their psychology is random. Nothing escaped the scientist's control. And now consider whether this person is morally responsible for their actions, whether they deserve praise or blame. And the intuition is no. They are not responsible because their actions flow from programmed psychology, from values and desires they did not choose, that were imposed on them. And responsibility requires that psychology be one's own, not be externally determined. And the manipulated person's psychology is not their own, is the scientist's creation, and so they lack responsibility, lack free will. The manipulation argument proceeds through cases, starts with extreme manipulation, obvious programming, and then gradually moves toward more natural cases, and asks at each stage whether the person is responsible, and the cases are designed to show that there is no relevant difference between manipulation and natural causation, that if manipulation undermines responsibility, then natural determination also undermines responsibility. And the four-case argument, Pereboom's version, goes as follows. In case 1, a person is directly manipulated by scientists who induce specific mental states. In case 2, a person is programmed from birth by scientists who arrange their environment and training. In case 3, a person is determined by their genetic, inheritance, and upbringing without any intentional manipulation. In case 4, a person is determined by the normal causal processes of a deterministic universe, and Pereboom argues that there is no morally relevant difference between these cases, that if case 1 undermines responsibility, then so do the others. And since case 4 is just determinism, determinism undermines responsibility, and compatibilism is false. Visualize the progression, from direct neural manipulation to genetic engineering to natural upbringing to deterministic causation. And at each stage, the person's psychology is caused by factors beyond their control, factors they did not choose. And the manipulation argument says that the source of causation, whether intentional or natural, does not matter for responsibility. What matters is that the person's psychology was determined by factors beyond their control. And this determination undermines freedom regardless of whether a scientist or nature did the determining. And if we agree that the manipulated person, in case 1, is not responsible, then we must agree that naturally determined persons, in case 4, are also not responsible, and compatibilism, which says determinism is compatible with responsibility, is refuted. Compatibilists respond to the manipulation argument with various strategies. One response distinguishes between manipulation and natural determination, argues that manipulation involves bypassing the person's normal, deliberative processes, involves imposing psychology externally, while natural determination involves the person's psychology developing through normal processes, through learning and experience and interaction with the world. And this difference matters for responsibility, makes naturally determined persons responsible, even though manipulated persons are not. And the manipulation argument fails because it ignores this difference, treats all determination as equivalent when it is not. Another compatibilist response argues that the manipulated person is responsible, challenges the intuition that manipulation undermines responsibility, and this response requires biting the bullet, accepting that even persons whose psychology was programmed by scientists are responsible as long as their actions flow from their own deliberation, their own reasons, even if those reasons were installed. And this response preserves compatibilism by denying that manipulation undermines responsibility, by insisting that what matters for responsibility is not the origin of psychology, but its current functional organization. And if the person deliberates and acts on their deliberations, then they are responsible, regardless of how their psychology came to be. A third compatibilist response distinguishes between historical and structural accounts of responsibility, argues that responsibility depends on the structure of the person's psychology, on whether they have the right kind of control mechanisms, the right kind of reflective capacities, not on the history of how that psychology was formed and manipulated. Persons can have the right structure, even if their history is abnormal, and so they are responsible. And the manipulation argument fails because it assumes that history matters when only structure matters, and compatibilism is preserved by adopting a structural rather than historical account of responsibility. Incompatibilists defend the manipulation argument, defend the intuition that manipulation undermines responsibility, and argue that compatibilist responses are ad hoc, are motivated by a desire to save compatibilism rather than by principled distinctions, and there is no relevant difference between being determined by a scientist and being determined by genes and environment. Both involve the person's psychology being shaped by factors beyond their control. Both undermine the kind of control required for responsibility, and the manipulation argument succeeds in showing that compatibilism is false, that determination, whether by manipulation or by nature, is inconsistent with freedom. The manipulation argument also raises questions about what responsibility requires, about whether responsibility is historical, depends on how psychology was formed, or structural, depends only on current organization, and this debate is central to understanding free will, to clarifying what kind of control is required for moral responsibility, and the manipulation argument forces this debate into the open, makes it explicit. And even if the argument does not definitively refute compatibilism, it succeeds in challenging compatibilists to articulate their view clearly, to explain what distinguishes responsible from non-responsible agents. The programmed person walks through life, choosing, deliberating, acting, and feeling free. And the question remains whether they are genuinely responsible, whether their choices are truly their own, or whether they are puppets, implementations of the scientist's design, and the manipulation argument uses this person to challenge compatibilism, to question whether natural determination is really different from artificial manipulation, and the argument persists as one of the most powerful challenges to compatibilist theories. A challenge that highlights the difference between feeling free and being free, between subjective experience of choice and objective reality of determination. And the manipulated person remains choosing but programmed, free-feeling but determined, and whether such a person is responsible remains contested. And the manipulation argument endures as a permanent challenge to compatibilism, forcing recognition that if determinism is true, then we are all in a sense manipulated, determined by factors beyond our control, and whether this determination undermines responsibility, whether it makes us unfree, remains one of the deepest questions in philosophy of free will. The omnipotence paradox. Can God create a rock so heavy that God cannot lift it? A theologian proclaims that God is omnipotent, all-powerful, able to do anything, and this claim is central to many religious traditions. Reflects the idea that God is unlimited, unconstrained, the ultimate being with ultimate power, and yet a simple question reveals a logical puzzle, a challenge to the coherence of omnipotence. And the question asks whether God can create a rock so heavy that God cannot lift it. And this question seems innocent, but it creates a dilemma. Because if God can create such a rock, then there is something God cannot do, namely, lift the rock. And so God is not omnipotent. And if God cannot create such a rock, then again, there is something God cannot do, namely, create the unliftable rock. And so again, God is not omnipotent. And either way, omnipotence seems impossible, seems self-contradictory, and this is the omnipotence paradox, also called the stone paradox, a puzzle that has troubled theologians and philosophers for centuries, forcing them to clarify what omnipotence means, what powers an all-powerful being could and could not have, and whether the concept of omnipotence is even coherent. Imagine the scenario concretely. God stands in a cosmic workshop, materials at hand, ready to create, and God decides to make a rock, but not just any rock, a rock so massive, so heavy, so immovable that even God's infinite power cannot lift it, and God sets to work, shaping matter, compressing mass, until the rock is complete, and then God tries to lift it, and the rock does not budge. God pulls and pushes and exerts all divine force, but the rock remains on the ground, unliftable. And this seems to show that God is not omnipotent, because there is something God cannot do, cannot lift this particular rock. And yet if God never creates the rock, if God admits that creating such a rock is impossible, then this also shows God is not omnipotent, because there is something God cannot create. And the paradox presents a forced choice. Neither option preserves omnipotence, and the concept seems to collapse under its own logic. The paradox can be generalized beyond rocks. The question could be whether God can create a task so difficult that God cannot complete it, whether God can create a being so powerful that God cannot control it, whether God can make a rule so binding that God cannot break it, and in each case the same structure emerges. Either God can create the limiting thing, in which case God is limited by it, or God cannot create it, in which case God is limited by the inability to create it. And either way, God's power has boundaries, and omnipotence seems impossible. And this suggests that omnipotence might be an incoherent concept, might not be logically possible, might be like a square circle or a married bachelor, something that sounds meaningful but actually combines contradictory ideas and cannot exist. Theologians and philosophers have developed several responses to the paradox, attempting to show that omnipotence is coherent and that the paradox rests on misunderstandings or ambiguities. One common response is to restrict omnipotence to logically possible tasks, to say that God can do anything that is logically possible but cannot do things that are logically impossible, and creating a rock that an omnipotent being cannot lift is logically impossible, is self-contradictory, because omnipotence includes the ability to lift anything, and so a rock that cannot be lifted by an omnipotent being is a logical impossibility, like a square circle. And God's inability to create logical impossibilities does not limit God's power in any meaningful sense, because logical impossibilities are not real tasks, are not things that could be done. And so excluding them from the scope of omnipotence is not a limitation but a clarification. Visualize omnipotence as a set of powers: the power to create anything logically possible, the power to know anything knowable, the power to do anything doable. And the set does not include impossible things, does not include making square circles or creating married bachelors or lifting unliftable rocks. Because these are not tasks, are not possibilities, are just combinations of words that do not refer to any coherent state of affairs. And just as we do not think a mathematician is limited because they cannot prove that 2 + 2 = 5, we should not think God is limited because God cannot do logically impossible things, because these are not things, are not genuine constraints on power. Another response distinguishes between God's essential attributes and God's contingent choices, and argues that omnipotence means God has the power to do anything consistent with God's nature. And part of God's nature is being omnipotent, and so God cannot create a situation where God lacks omnipotence, because that would contradict God's nature. But this is not a limitation on God's power. It is a feature of what God is. And just as God cannot make God not exist, because God is a necessary being, God cannot make God not omnipotent, because omnipotence is essential to God. And the rock scenario asks God to create a contradiction, to remain omnipotent while becoming not omnipotent, and this is incoherent. And God's inability to do it reflects logical necessity, not weakness. A third response embraces the paradox and argues that it shows omnipotence is paradoxical, is not a coherent concept, and rather than defending omnipotence, we should acknowledge that God's power, while immense, is not literally unlimited, that there are things God cannot do, and this is not a defect in God but a recognition that power, like any concept, has logical limits. And some religious traditions, particularly in Eastern philosophy, are comfortable with divine paradoxes, with the idea that ultimate reality transcends logical categories, and the paradox of omnipotence is just one of many paradoxes that arise when finite human concepts are applied to the infinite divine. The paradox also appears in discussions of free will and divine foreknowledge, because if God knows the future infallibly, then God knows what choices humans will make. And if God knows what choices humans will make, then humans cannot choose otherwise, Because if they could, then God's knowledge would be wrong, and so divine omniscience seems to eliminate human free will. And this creates a dilemma similar to the omnipotence paradox. Either God is not omniscient, does not know future free choices, or humans are not free, do not have genuine choice. And both options are unpalatable to many theologians who want to preserve both divine perfection and human freedom. And various solutions have been proposed, involving timeless knowledge, middle knowledge, open theism, but none has won universal acceptance, and the tension remains. The omnipotence paradox reveals that the concept of unlimited power is more complex than it first appears, that power operates within logical and conceptual constraints, and that saying God is all-powerful does not mean God can do literally anything we can describe in words, but only that God can do anything that is genuinely possible, anything that makes sense. And the paradox serves as a test case, forces clarification of what omnipotence means, pushes theologians to be precise about divine attributes, and shows that even the most basic theological claims require careful, philosophical analysis to be made coherent. God stands before the rock, or does not create the rock, and the paradox hangs in the air, a logical puzzle about power and limits, about possibility and coherence. And the answer depends on how omnipotence is defined, on whether logical impossibilities are excluded, on whether God's nature places constraints on divine action. And different traditions answer differently. Some saying God transcends logic, some saying logic constrains even God. And the omnipotence paradox remains, not fully resolved, still debated, still used to challenge and clarify theological concepts. And the rock sits there, hypothetical and impossible, a monument to the difficulties of thinking clearly about ultimate power, about infinite abilities, about what it means to say God can do anything. And the paradox persists, elegant and troubling, a reminder that even divine attributes, even the powers of an unlimited being, must answer to logic, must cohere, must make sense, and that the concept of omnipotence, for all its simplicity, conceals depths and difficulties that philosophy continues to explore. The paradox of analysis, how explaining something makes it meaningless. A philosopher attempts to analyze a concept, to provide a definition that captures its meaning precisely, and suppose the concept is knowledge, and the philosopher proposes that knowledge is justified true belief. And this analysis, if correct, should be informative, should tell us something we did not already know about what knowledge is, should illuminate the concept by breaking it down into simpler components. But here emerges a paradox articulated by C.H. Langford and discussed extensively by G.E. Moore, because if the analysis is correct, then the analysandum, the concept being analysed, and the analysans, the analysis itself, must have the same meaning, must be synonymous, otherwise the analysis would be incorrect, would not capture what knowledge really is. But if they are synonymous, then stating the analysis provides no new information, becomes a tautology, becomes equivalent to saying knowledge is knowledge, which is trivial, tells us nothing. And so the analysis cannot be both correct and informative. If it is correct, then it is trivial. If it is informative, then it is not a genuine analysis, but merely a stipulation or a proposed change of meaning. And this is the paradox of analysis, a puzzle about whether conceptual analysis is even possible, whether we can both correctly identify the meaning of a concept and provide new insight into that concept. Imagine presenting the analysis to someone who understands the concept of knowledge, who uses the word correctly, who can distinguish cases where knowledge is present from cases where it is absent, and you tell them that knowledge is justified true belief. And if they already knew this, if the definition merely makes explicit what was implicit in their understanding, then the analysis is correct but uninformative, tells them nothing new. But if they learn something, if the analysis reveals something they did not already know, then it seems the analysis is changing the concept rather than analysing it, is offering a new concept rather than clarifying the old one. And either way, the analysis fails to do what philosophical analysis is supposed to do, both correctly identify meaning and provide insight. The paradox challenges the entire enterprise of conceptual analysis, challenges the method that has been central to analytic philosophy for over a century. The method of taking ordinary concepts like knowledge, justice, truth, and providing precise definitions. And if the paradox cannot be resolved, then conceptual analysis is either impossible or pointless. Either it cannot be done correctly, or when done correctly, it provides no insight. And this threatens one of philosophy's main methods, forces philosophers to reconsider what they're doing when they offer analyses, what counts as success and whether analysis is discovery or stipulation. Visualize the paradox as a dilemma. On one horn, the analysans and analysandum are synonymous, have the same meaning, and the analysis is correct but trivial, like saying a bachelor is an unmarried man, which is true but uninformative because anyone who understands the word bachelor already knows this. And on the other horn, the analysans and analysandum differ in meaning, and the analysis is informative but incorrect, provides new information but does not capture what the original concept meant. And either way, the analysis fails to achieve the goal of being both correct and informative. And the paradox seems to show that this goal is impossible, that correctness and informativeness are incompatible in conceptual analysis. One response distinguishes between sense and reference, between how a concept is presented and what it refers to, and argues that an analysis can have the same reference as the analysandum while differing in sense, and so the analysis is informative because it presents the concept differently, makes explicit aspects that were implicit even though it refers to the same thing, and the analysis knowledge is justified. True belief is informative because even though knowledge and justified true belief refer to the same set of cases, they present those cases differently, one as a simple concept and the other as a complex structure. And learning the structure is learning something new, even though the reference remains the same. And this response draws on Frege's distinction between sense and reference, uses it to explain how analyses can be both correct and informative. Another response appeals to implicit versus explicit knowledge, argues that competent speakers have implicit understanding of concepts, understand how to use them correctly, but lack explicit understanding, cannot state the definition, and conceptual analysis makes implicit knowledge explicit, converts procedural knowledge into propositional knowledge, and this conversion is informative even though it does not add to what was implicitly known, and the analysis is correct because it captures the implicit understanding and informative because it makes that understanding explicit and available for reflection. And so the paradox dissolves because correctness and informativeness are compatible when we recognize that knowledge comes in implicit and explicit forms. A third response questions whether analyses are meant to be synonymous, argues that philosophical analyses are not claims about linguistic meaning, but claims about the nature of things, about what knowledge really is, about its essential properties, and knowledge is justified. True belief is not a claim about what the word means, but a claim about what knowledge consists in, about its metaphysical structure. And this claim can be informative, even if it is necessarily true, even if knowledge could not be otherwise, because discovering necessary truths is informative. Learning that water is H2O was informative, even though it is necessarily true that water is H2O, and so philosophical analysis is more like scientific discovery than like lexicography, more like finding out what things are than like defining words. And the paradox assumes the wrong model of analysis. The paradox also connects to debates about analyticity and the analytic-synthetic distinction, because if analyses are analytic truths, true in virtue of meaning, then they should be trivial, should be knowable a priori just by understanding the concepts. But many proposed analyses are controversial, are rejected by competent speakers, and this suggests either that analyses are not analytic, or that analyticity is more complex than traditionally thought. And Quine's critique of the analytic-synthetic distinction can be seen as embracing the paradox, as arguing that there are no purely analytic truths, that all statements are revisable, that meaning and fact are not sharply separated, and so philosophical analyses are not discoveries of meaning, but proposals for how to understand concepts, and their value is pragmatic, depends on whether they illuminate, rather than whether they are correct in some absolute sense. The paradox remains unresolved. Different philosophers offer different solutions based on different theories of meaning and different conceptions of what philosophical analysis aims to achieve. And the paradox continues to challenge the methodology of analytic philosophy, forces ongoing reflection on what analysis is, what it can accomplish, and whether the goals of correctness and informativeness can be reconciled, or whether philosophy must choose between them. And the concept of knowledge sits waiting for analysis, and the philosopher proposes justified true belief. And the question remains whether this is a discovery or a stipulation, whether it is correct or informative, or neither or both. And the paradox persists, a puzzle about philosophy's methods, about whether conceptual analysis is possible, about the relationship between understanding and articulation, between implicit grasp and explicit formulation, and whether the attempt to make our concepts precise enriches or distorts them, captures their meaning or creates new meanings. And the paradox endures as a permanent challenge to philosophical methodology, a question about whether philosophy can deliver on its promise to analyze and clarify concepts, or whether the very attempt to analyze creates a problem that cannot be solved without giving up either the goal of correctness or the goal of informativeness. And the analysis hangs there, proposed but problematic, informative or correct, but not both, and the paradox remains. The paradox of fiction, why we cry for people who don't exist. A person sits in a dark theatre watching a film, and on the screen a character faces tragedy, loses a loved one, experiences betrayal, suffers deeply, and the person watching feels genuine emotion, feels sadness, feels tears forming, feels the physiological responses of grief, and yet the person knows that what is happening on screen is not real, knows that the characters are fictional, that no one actually died, that the suffering is pretend, is mere actors following a script in front of cameras. And this creates a puzzle because emotions seem to require beliefs, seem to depend on thinking that something is really happening, that genuine harm or loss has occurred, and if you do not believe something is real, then you should not have emotional responses to it. And yet, fiction produces powerful emotions, despite the audience knowing it is fiction. And this is the paradox of fiction, articulated by Colin Radford and others. The question of how we can be moved by what we know to be false, how we can fear for characters we know do not exist, how we can grieve losses we know never happened. And the paradox challenges our understanding of emotion, raises questions about the relationship between belief and feeling, and forces recognition that emotional responses are more complex than simple belief response models suggest. Imagine watching a horror film, a scene where the protagonist is chased by a monster, and your heart races, adrenaline surges, you feel fear, genuine fear, and yet you know you are safe. Know you are sitting in a theatre, know that no monster exists, that the events on screen are fabricated, and if fear requires believing you are in danger, then you should not feel fear, should remain calm, should watch with detachment, but you do not. You respond emotionally, despite knowing the fiction is not real, and this emotional engagement is not a mistake, not a failure of rationality, but is how fiction works, how stories affect us. And the paradox asks how this is possible, how belief and emotion relate when they seem to come apart in cases of fiction. The paradox can be formulated as three inconsistent claims. First, we have emotional responses to fictional characters and events. We cry at sad movies, laugh at comedies, feel suspense in thrillers, and this is undeniable. Second, emotional responses require beliefs about the reality of their objects. You cannot fear something you know does not threaten you, cannot grieve something you know did not happen. Emotions are directed at states of affairs we believe obtain. And third, we do not believe fictional characters and events are real. We know they are fictional, know that no one is actually in danger, that no loss actually occurred. And these three claims are inconsistent. Any two imply the negation of the third, and resolving the paradox requires rejecting or modifying one of them. Visualize the emotional response as a two-stage process. First comes the perception or imagination of a situation, seeing the character in danger, imagining their suffering, and second comes the emotion, the fear or sadness or joy, and normally these two stages are connected through belief. You perceive danger and believe it is real, and this causes fear. But in fiction, the connection is different. You perceive or imagine danger, but do not believe it is real, and yet fear occurs anyway. And the paradox asks what mediates the connection in fiction, if not belief. One response denies the second claim, argues that emotions do not require beliefs, that emotional responses can be triggered by perceptions or imaginings without requiring that we believe what we perceive or imagine is real, and this response treats emotions as more primitive than beliefs, as responses that evolved to deal with immediate situations and that can be activated by representations even when we know those representations are not real. And fiction works by hijacking these emotional systems, by presenting stimuli that trigger emotional responses directly without requiring belief. And so we fear fictional monsters, because our fear system responds to the representation of danger even when we know the danger is fictional. Another response modifies the first claim, argues that the emotions we feel toward fiction are not genuine emotions, but quasi-emotions, pale imitations of real emotions that lack certain components. And when we cry at a movie, we are not really sad, not in the way we would be sad if the events were real, but we are experiencing something similar, a simulation or shadow of sadness. And this quasi-emotion does not require belief because it is not the full genuine article, and this response preserves the connection between belief and genuine emotion while explaining fiction through a different kind of response that resembles emotion without being emotion. A third response, associated with Kendall Walton, appeals to imaginative engagement, argues that when we engage with fiction, we make believe. We imagine that the fictional events are real, and our emotional responses are responses to what we imagine rather than to what we believe. And imagination can trigger emotional responses without requiring belief, can produce fear and sadness and joy through imagined scenarios. And fiction invites us to imagine certain things, and our emotions follow from these imaginings. And this response treats make-believe as a distinct cognitive mode, different from both belief and mere perception, a mode that can generate emotions without requiring that we believe the imagined content is real. The paradox also raises questions about the function of fiction, about why we engage with fictional narratives, why we subject ourselves to emotions triggered by events we know are not real, and various answers have been proposed. Perhaps fiction allows us to explore possibilities, to experience situations vicariously, to rehearse emotional responses in safe contexts. Perhaps it serves social functions, helps us understand others, builds empathy, creates shared experiences, or perhaps it provides aesthetic pleasure, the enjoyment of well-crafted narratives regardless of their truth. And understanding why fiction moves us might help explain how it moves us, might reveal the mechanisms that connect fictional representations to emotional responses. The paradox extends beyond fiction to other representational arts, to paintings that depict scenes that never occurred, to music that evokes emotions without representing anything, to imaginative scenarios we generate ourselves when daydreaming or planning. And in all these cases, emotions arise without corresponding beliefs about reality. And this suggests that the relationship between emotion and belief is more flexible than the paradox assumes, that emotions can be triggered in multiple ways, through beliefs about reality, but also through perceptions, imaginings, representations, and stimuli that engage our emotional systems directly. Some philosophers argue that the paradox reveals important truths about the nature of emotion, that emotions are not simply cognitive responses to believed states of affairs, but are complex phenomena involving perception, imagination, physiological arousal, and behavioral dispositions. And these components can dissociate, can come apart, and in fiction, we have the perceptual and imaginative components without the belief component, and this dissociation produces emotional responses that are real but not fully equivalent to emotions directed at reality. And so the paradox is not a problem to solve, but a feature to explain, a demonstration of the complexity of emotional life. The theatre darkens, the film plays, the character suffers, and the audience cries, knowing it is fiction, yet moved nonetheless. And the paradox remains a puzzle about how art affects us, how representation produces emotion, how we can care about what we know does not exist. And the tears are real, even though their object is not. And this strange combination, this ability to be moved by acknowledged fiction, is central to human experience, is what makes stories powerful, makes art meaningful, makes imagination a source of feeling as potent as reality. And the paradox endures, unresolved in the sense that no consensus solution has emerged. No account of emotion in fiction that satisfies all philosophers, only a recognition that fiction moves us, that we respond emotionally to representations, that imagination and emotion are deeply connected, and that the relationship between belief and feeling is more complex than we thought. And the paradox persists as a reminder that human psychology is subtle, that cognitive and emotional systems interact in non-obvious ways, and that the ability to be moved by fiction, far from being a problem or a mistake, is a capacity that enriches life, that allows us to experience more than our immediate circumstances, to feel for others, to explore possibilities, and to find meaning in stories we know are not true. The paradox of the court, when a student's promise becomes impossible to keep. An ancient story tells of a law teacher named Protagoras and his student Euathlus, and they make an agreement. The student is too poor to pay tuition up front, and so they agree that the student will pay the teacher after winning his first court case, and the teacher provides instruction, teaches the student rhetoric and law and argumentation, and the student completes his training, becomes skilled in legal reasoning, but then the student never takes a case, never appears in court, never wins anything, and years pass and the teacher has not been paid, and finally the teacher sues the student, takes him to court to demand payment. And now the paradox emerges because the case creates a logical impossibility, a situation where no judgment can be coherent, where the law contradicts itself. And this is the paradox of the court, also called Protagoras' paradox, a puzzle about legal reasoning, contracts, and self-reference that has no satisfactory solution. Imagine the trial. The teacher presents his case, arguing first that if he wins the lawsuit, then the court will order the student to pay, and the student will be legally obligated to pay the agreed tuition. And second, that if he loses the lawsuit, then the student has won his first case. And according to the original agreement, the student must pay after winning his first case. And so, either way, the student must pay, whether the court rules for the teacher or for the student. The contract ensures payment, and this argument seems impeccable, seems to show that the student cannot avoid payment, that filing the lawsuit was a clever move, that forces the student into a position where any outcome requires payment. But now the student, trained in rhetoric by the teacher himself, presents a counter-argument of equal force, arguing first that if he wins the lawsuit, then the court will rule in his favour, and he will not be legally obligated to pay, and second, that if he loses the lawsuit, then he has not won his first case. And according to the original agreement, he only pays after winning his first case. And so either way, he does not have to pay. Whether the court rules for him or against him, the contract protects him from payment. And this argument also seems impeccable, seems to show that the student cannot be forced to pay, that the lawsuit was a mistake that creates a situation where no outcome requires payment. Visualize the judge sitting in court, listening to both arguments, recognizing that both are logically valid, both follow from the premises, both reach opposite conclusions, and the judge must render a verdict, must decide whether the student pays or does not pay. But any decision seems arbitrary, seems to violate logic, because if the judge rules for the teacher, then the student wins his first case and does not have to pay, according to the contract. And if the judge rules for the student, then the student loses and does have to pay, according to the contract. And so, the judge's decision determines the opposite of what it declares, creates a self-contradicting outcome, and the law becomes incoherent, and the case cannot be decided without paradox. The paradox reveals a problem with self-referential contracts, contracts whose terms depend on the outcome of litigation about those very terms, because such contracts create loops, create situations where the contract's fulfillment depends on whether the contract is enforced, and whether it is enforced depends on whether it is fulfilled. And this circular dependency generates contradictions, makes it impossible to apply the law consistently, and the paradox shows that some contracts, even if agreed to voluntarily by competent parties, are legally unenforceable. Not because they violate public policy or lack consideration, but because they are logically incoherent, because no court can implement them without contradiction. One proposed resolution is to distinguish between two different questions: the question of whether the student owes the teacher money according to the contract, and the question of whether the court should order the student to pay. And these are separate issues. The contract might create an obligation that the court nonetheless refuses to enforce, and the court could rule in favour of the student on the narrow question of whether the lawsuit succeeds, while still recognising that the student has a moral obligation under the contract to pay once he wins his first case elsewhere. And this resolution separates legal enforcement from contractual obligation, allows both arguments to be partially correct. The teacher is right that the student owes money, the student is right that the court should not order payment, and the paradox dissolves because the two contradictory outcomes apply to different questions. Another resolution appeals to temporal priority, arguing that the lawsuit itself does not count as the student's first case for purposes of the contract, because the contract was made before the lawsuit, and counting the lawsuit as the first case would mean the contract refers to itself, which creates the paradox. And so the court should interpret the contract as referring to the first case other than the lawsuit about the contract itself. And under this interpretation, if the teacher wins the lawsuit, the student must pay, because the lawsuit is not the first case that triggers payment. And if the student wins the lawsuit, the student does not pay, because the student still has not won a first case other than this one. And the paradox is resolved by excluding self-referential applications of the contract terms. A third resolution argues that the contract is void because it is impossible to perform, because there is no possible world where the terms are satisfied without contradiction, and impossible contracts are unenforceable. And so the judge should declare the contract void and dismiss the case, leaving the student with no legal obligation, but perhaps a moral obligation to pay the teacher for services rendered. And this resolution sacrifices the contract to preserve logical coherence, treats the paradox as showing that the agreement was fatally flawed from the beginning. The paradox also raises questions about the limits of freedom of contract, about whether parties should be allowed to make any agreement they choose, or whether law should refuse to enforce agreements that are logically incoherent. And most legal systems recognize some limits, refuse to enforce contracts that are impossible, illegal, or against public policy, and the paradox of the court suggests adding logical coherence as another limit, another requirement for enforceability. And this means that Contracting parties cannot create obligations that are self-referentially paradoxical, cannot make agreements whose terms depend on their own enforcement in ways that generate contradictions. The paradox has modern analogues in cases involving conditional gifts and trusts, where someone leaves property to another person on condition that the recipient perform some act. And if the act is defined in terms of legal outcomes about the gift itself, then paradoxes can arise, similar to the ancient case of the teacher and student, and courts have developed various doctrines to handle these cases, generally interpreting conditions to avoid self-reference, to prevent the kind of logical loops that the paradox of the court exemplifies. The courtroom stands empty, the ancient case unresolved, the judge unable to render coherent judgment, and the paradox remains a teaching tool in logic and law, an illustration of how self-reference creates problems, how circular definitions generate contradictions, and how even voluntary agreements between competent parties can be unenforceable if their structure is logically incoherent. And Protagoras and Euathlus remain frozen in their dispute, both right and both wrong, both entitled to payment and entitled to refuse payment. And the paradox persists as a reminder that logic constrains law, that not everything that can be agreed to can be enforced, and that self-reference, whether in contracts or in statements or in rules, is a source of paradox that must be handled carefully to avoid contradiction.